A lot of beginner watercolour painters struggle with painting cast shadows, so today I'm going to show you how I paint them. I get asked about painting shadows all the time, and it's something that some beginners tend to struggle with. So in this video I'm going to show you how I paint them. I want to focus on cast shadows rather than form shadows. Cast shadows are the shadows made by an object, whereas form shadows are the areas on an object that are not in the light. This shadow here on my gardenia painting is a cast shadow. Here on my eucalyptus leaves, the cast shadows are sitting on the leaves themselves. The leaves above are casting a shadow onto the leaves below. And here on my giraffe painting, I've got some form shadows. There's some here on the jaw and here on the necks. The form shadows help to define the form or the shape of the giraffe. So in this video, I want to focus on cast shadows rather than the form shadows that you see here on the giraffes. Shadows are really important to your painting, and I often choose reference photos because of the cast shadows that I see in the photo. I find that the shadows make my painting more interesting to look at. For example, this is a monstera plant that I have sitting in a pot on my deck. I took photos of it for a painting. I ended up painting from the photo on the left because of the shape of that beautiful cast shadow on the leaf there. That's what attracted me to it. And this is how the painting turned out. There are a few things to remember when you paint a cast shadow. Basically, you want to remember that they vary in tone, colour and form. Let's have a look at this apple here. An important thing to remember is the darkest part of the shadow is right near the object that's casting it. So right in here, that's where the shadow is darkest. The further away the shadow is from the object, the lighter the shadow becomes. Another thing to remember is that cast shadows touch the object that is casting them. And as far as colours go, shadows aren't just grey. They might have some reflected colours in them from things that surround them. So here I can see some yellow reflected, and I can also see some red. And cast shadows in bright light will be darker than cast shadows in weaker light. And the edges of the shadow will be hard in bright light, and in paler light, the edges of the shadow will be soft and fuzzy. So those things are important, and they can help you make decisions when you're painting your shadows. The number one problem I see with cast shadows painted by beginners is that they're too dark. They also tend to be one drab colour. When they're too dark, my eye will go straight to the shadow and the whole painting will look out of balance to me. I try not to make my shadows too dark. I know I can always go back and paint another layer over the top if I don't think it's dark enough. So now I want to show you how I paint them. Yesterday I painted this capsicum that has a cast shadow on it. I'm going to run quickly through the footage of where I'm painting the capsicum so that you can see me do that, and then I'll show you how I painted the shadow. This is the reference photo that I took of the capsicum. I took the photo out in the sun on my deck just to make sure that I got that really dark cast shadow there that I can use. I'll quickly run through how I painted the capsicum so you can see me do that. This is Scarlet Lake that I'm using. I'm painting a wash over the top. I'm painting this on damp paper. So I get a layer of that over the top, and then I'm going to drop in another red. This colour here is cadmium red. I drop that onto the damp Scarlet Lake and the two colours blend together. In case you're interested, I'm painting on Saunders Waterford watercolour paper here. This is cold pressed paper. Then I let the paint dry a little and I use my damp brush to start removing some highlights. So that just takes a bit of paint off. I wipe my brush on a cloth as I do it. This will help to make the capsicum look like it's shiny. When that's completely dry, I re-wet one side of the capsicum. I want to work on the damp paper and I want to boost the colour. And I'm working on the damp paper because I want the paint edges to be soft. And this is cadmium red that I have on my brush now. And the brush that I'm using is a Da Vinci Maestro brush. This is a series 35 and it's a number 8. Now I'm starting to drop in some of the darker colour that I see on the capsicum. This is Windsor Violet that I'm using, and that's blending with the red. I run it down this side of the capsicum, and wherever I see that darker colour, that's where I put the Windsor Violet. Then I start to do the same thing on the other side. And I keep going all over with the cadmium red and then the Windsor Violet, and then I'll have to dry this off and assess it again, and I'll probably have to put another layer over the top. When this layer starts to dry, I can use my brush again to remove the highlights again. This is an old acrylic painting brush that I'm using. It's a bit stiffer than my watercolour brushes. I dried it off. Now I need to boost the colour again. So this time I'm painting on dry paper. I'm using the cadmium red again. I'm painting around those highlights that I pulled out with my brush. I'm going to use a damp brush to soften the edge of that highlight so that I don't have those hard paint edges. So before that paint dries, I use my damp brush to rub over the edge of the paint there, and that takes away those hard edges. And I do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm coming back and giving this another layer. So it takes a few layers to build up the colour. And I can add some more of the Windsor Violet if I need it. So I'm working on the damp paper here, and that keeps those paint edges soft. So here I'll quickly speed up the top section. This is sap green that I'm using. And then before that sap green dries, I come back with some darker sap green, so it's got more pigment mixed into it. And then I use some perylene green. And I soften it with my other brush. Okay, now for the shadow. I'm using French ultramarine here and burnt sienna, and I'm mixing them together to make a grey. So I'll add some water to that to dilute it. I tend to favour cool shadows, so I like to put a bit of extra blue in my shadows. So that's what I'm going to use as the main colour of the shadow, but I will drop other colours into it. So my capsicum is dry. Now I'm painting some water onto the shadow. So I'll take this water right to the edge of the shadow where my pencil line is. This shadow has got hard edges, so I can take my paint right to the edge of the water. I talk more about hard and soft edges and taking the paint right to the edge of the water in a video that I made a few weeks ago. Okay, so now I start to paint the shadow on. I've got my grey paint and I put the brush right up hard against the capsicum because that's where the darkest colour is. So my brush is fully loaded with paint. That's where I place the brush first, right up against the capsicum. Then as I move away from the capsicum, the colour will be slightly lighter. So I will dip my brush in the water and take some of the paint off. So now I dip my brush in the water and I've just taken a bit of paint off my brush so that it's not so dark. Now on these outer edges of this shadow, the colour will be a bit lighter. It's not a noticeable difference, it's just a subtle difference. So I need a bit more paint on my brush. I've run out, so I'll pick some watery paint up. So it's not quite as dark as that first colour that I put on there. The reason I wet the paper before I painted on it was because I wanted to have time to drop other colours in, and I also wanted to have time to adjust this grey that I'm putting on now. So here I'm dropping in some more of that pigment just to darken that area up closer to the capsicum. So now I can drop in my other colours. So I'm going to use some Windsor Violet because I used that on the capsicum. I'll repeat the colour in the shadow. I'm also going to put some cadmium red into the shadow, which will be a reflected colour that's coming off the capsicum. So here's the red that I used on the capsicum. Dropping colours in like this is called charging, and I made a video about this technique last week, so have a look at that if you need to know more. Doing this makes the shadow more interesting to look at than it would if I left it just grey. There's a little section up here too. That's the shadow of the stem. So there it is after it had dried, and you can see those reflected colours in the shadow. It's not just grey, and I've got the colour darker near the capsicum, which is what I wanted. The shadow on this capsicum has hard edges because I took the photo out in the sun. If I'd taken the photo inside, or if I was painting the capsicum from real life inside, the shadow would be much more soft and subtle. If I wanted to paint a shadow that was soft and subtle, I'd do two things. I'd make the colour of the shadow paler, and I'd give the shadow soft fuzzy edges rather than the hard sharp edges that I've got on this one. If you want to know how to get soft fuzzy paint edges, watch this video. As far as colours on shadows go, sometimes I'll use grey like I did on the capsicum, but I'll drop other colours into it to liven it up. Sometimes when I paint shadows, I'll use the colours that I used on the subject itself, like I have here on this gardenia painting. Here on these eucalyptus leaves, I have cast shadows on the paper and also on the leaves. On the background shadows, I've used a pale grey, but I've dropped in some violet, and I've also dropped in some yellow that I saw reflected in the shadow. On the shadows on the leaves, I've used a darker green and also some blue. Here on these daffodils, the shadows are cast onto the petals rather than the background. And I've used greens and even some orange that was reflected from the flower. Other times I'll be a bit more daring and I'll use some artistic license to liven things up, like on this drawing I did of this little bulldog. Complementary colours are also a good choice. So if you paint a duckling, for example, a good colour choice for the shadow would be violet. So there you are, there's a few tips about painting cast shadows. I hope this video was helpful to you. Thanks for watching. Please give it a like and hit the subscribe button, and I will get working on my next tutorial for you. I'll see you soon. I know that I can always go back and paint another layer over the top if I don't think it's dark enough. The shadow on this capsicum has a hard edge because it has one hard edge, just one. If you don't know how to do that and you want to know how to do that, I've got a video about soft fuzzy paint edges, so give that a watch. That was terrible. There are a few things to remember when you paint a cast shadow. Basically, you want to remember that they vary in tone, calm and fuller, I was going to say. Tone, corm and fuller. The shadows on this capsicum, there's two shadows on this capsicum. A lot of beginner watercolour painters struggle with cast shadows. They do. A lot of beginner watercolour painters struggle with cast shadows. I'll do it again. So in this video, I'll show you how I deal with them. I'll show you how I deal with them. I hope this video was helpful to you. Thanks for watching. Please give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Subscribe is a hard word to say, isn't it, Louise?